He was arrested in the park for provocation, while he was simply walking around wearing his red MAGA hat. The officer relished the humiliation, throwing sarcastic remarks and drowning the man in the jeers of the crowd, unaware of who he really was. But when the truth came to light, everyone who had laughed froze, and the officer had to face the most devastating consequences of his career. A story about how one wrong step turned everything upside down. On an early sunny morning, Jonathan Rivers, a fit man in his early 50s with short, neatly trimmed gray hair, was walking leisurely along a path in the city park. He wore dark jeans, a light jacket, and a bright red cap with the words, "Make America Great Again." His demeanor was confident, but his calm was interrupted by the sharp gaze of police officer Jack Carter, standing by a patrol car near the curb. Jack Carter, a 32-year-old officer with sharp features, had already noticed Jonathan from afar. He frowned, irritated by the sight of the red hat, and began walking toward him, exaggeratedly tapping his baton against his palm. "Good morning, sir," Carter began coldly as he approached. "Are you aware that wearing such symbols in public can provoke aggression?" Jonathan, maintaining a neutral expression, replied calmly, "It's just a hat. Am I breaking the law?" "It's not just a hat, it's a provocation." Carter raised his voice, clearly trying to draw attention from passers-by. A couple of people began to stop and watch the unfolding scene. Carter, feeling the approval of the small crowd, continued, "People like you only sow division. Let me see your ID." Jonathan, still composed, pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Carter, deliberately loud enough for the onlookers to hear, began examining the document, throwing in a sarcastic comment. "Well, of course, Jonathan Rivers, a typical MAGA guy, a rich man who couldn't care less about the rest of us." The crowd murmured. Someone pulled out their phone to record. Carter, enjoying the attention, barked, "Take off the hat, now." Jonathan remained motionless. "Officer, that would be a violation of my rights. If you believe I've broken the law, feel free to charge me." This response only infuriated Carter further. He snatched the hat off Jonathan's head and dramatically tossed it into a nearby puddle. "Now get out of here before I write you up for disobeying a lawful order." The gathered crowd gasped. Some laughed, while others recorded with even more fervor. Jonathan glanced at the hat, then back at Carter, and quietly said, "Are you sure you want to continue?" Carter stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Jonathan's chest. "Listen, old man, that symbol isn't welcome here. If you don't leave the park immediately, I'll arrest you for disorderly conduct." Jonathan didn't flinch. "Do what you think is necessary." That was the final straw for Carter. He cuffed Jonathan and loudly proclaimed to the crowd, "This is how we deal with troublemakers." Amid a mix of cheers and puzzled murmurs, Jonathan was escorted to the patrol car, his hat left abandoned in the puddle. The bystanders eagerly uploaded their recordings to social media. As the car drove off, Carter, sitting smugly behind the wheel, smirked, satisfied with his display of authority. Jonathan, in the back seat, remained silent, but his eyes betrayed a quiet confidence that this was just the beginning. The police car, with Jonathan Rivers in the back seat, came to a sharp stop in front of the local precinct. Jack Carter, radiating triumph, roughly pulled Jonathan out of the vehicle, making no effort to be gentle. A small group of Carter's colleagues stood in the parking lot, watching curiously. "Well, old man, how did you enjoy your stroll?" Carter sneered, shoving Jonathan toward the precinct doors. Jonathan, still calm, didn't reply. His silence only irritated Carter, who was clearly itching for a reaction. As they entered the building, Carter loudly announced, "We've got ourselves a provocateur in a red hat who thinks the law doesn't apply to him." His colleagues greeted the statement with amused smirks. One officer glanced at Jonathan and remarked, "This is the guy who riled you up? He just looks like an ordinary retiree." "Retiree?" Carter scoffed. "This guy thinks his hat makes him untouchable. I showed him how the law works." Carter led Jonathan into the station's duty room and deliberately forced him into a chair. There was no need for such a display, but Carter clearly relished his role. "So, Mr. Rivers," Carter said mockingly, rifling through paperwork on the desk, Why don't you tell us why you decided to spread hatred in a public place?" "Spread hatred?" Jonathan replied for the first time. "It seems to me you're doing a fine job of that yourself." An awkward silence filled the room. A few officers turned their heads, intrigued by the exchange. Carter smirked, though the tension in his expression was beginning to show. "Oh, you think you're clever, huh? Well, we'll see how smart you are after a few hours in a holding cell." With a gesture, Carter ordered a subordinate to take Jonathan to the detention room. As they walked, Carter continued loudly throwing out demeaning remarks. "People like you are what's ruining this city. You think your hat will protect you? Let's see how long you keep smiling." Jonathan stayed quiet, his expression composed. He didn't seem defeated, which only frustrated Carter further. When the cell door slammed shut behind Jonathan, Carter was already imagining the headlines. "Brave police officer arrests park provocateur." He didn't notice one of the junior officers quietly stepping aside to type something on their phone. Meanwhile, the video of Jonathan's arrest was gaining traction on social media. Viewers demanded answers, with some digging to uncover the identity of the man in the MAGA hat. An hour later, the precinct phone rang. It was the city's police captain, his voice cold and tense. "Stop this circus immediately. Bring the detainee to my office, and make sure Carter is there too." Carter, unaware of what was coming, smirked smugly. "Time for the grand finale." But as Jonathan was escorted out of the cell, the quiet confidence in his demeanor began to make some of the officers uneasy. A few were starting to realize that this wasn't just some elderly Republican in a red hat. Jonathan Rivers was led into the spacious office of the police captain. Carter stood against the wall, arms crossed, looking visibly satisfied as he awaited the continuation of the spectacle. The room also held two other officers, including the deputy captain, who looked noticeably concerned. Police Captain Thomas Grayson, a man in his 60s with a serious expression and a piercing gaze, looked at Jonathan before slowly turning his attention to Carter. His voice was sharp. "Carter, explain what's going on here." Carter smirked. "It's simple, sir. This man wearing his provocative MAGA hat caused a disturbance in the park. I acted within the law to prevent any potential conflicts." The captain raised an eyebrow. "A provocative hat? That's all you've got?" Carter shrugged. "Isn't that enough? People were complaining. I took action." Thomas Grayson slammed his palm on the desk. "Complaints, Carter? You arrested someone for a hat?" The captain turned to Jonathan, nodding respectfully. "Judge Rivers, please accept my sincerest apologies for what happened." The room froze. Carter blinked, his confidence starting to crumble. "Judge," he muttered. "What judge?" Grayson turned back to Carter, his voice icy. "Jonathan Rivers is a federal judge appointed over 10 years ago. You just humiliated one of the most respected figures in our jurisdiction, Carter." Carter turned pale but tried to defend himself. But he was acting provocatively. He could have sparked a conflict." Jonathan interrupted calmly. "I was simply walking in the park. The only conflict here was the one you created." The captain nodded firmly. "Judge Rivers, your rights will be fully restored. Would you like to file an official complaint?" Jonathan looked directly at Carter. His voice remained calm, but it carried a resolute authority. "I'll hold off on deciding for now. But this incident will not go unnoticed. Those entrusted with upholding the law have no right to abuse their power." Carter opened his mouth to speak, but the captain cut him off. "One more word, Carter, and I'll personally see to your suspension." At that moment, an officer entered the room holding a stack of papers. "Sir, the video of Judge Rivers' arrest has gone viral. It's already in the news, and people are demanding answers." Grayson turned to Carter, his expression dark. "Wonderful. Now your idiocy is a national topic." Jonathan rose from his chair. "I hold no personal grudge, Captain, but it seems you'll need to answer to more than just me." Carter stood in shock, realizing his career was hanging by a thread. Jonathan adjusted his MAGA hat, which had been returned to him, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, He gave Carter one last look. Sometimes it's wise to think before you act, especially when you don't know who you're dealing with. Carter couldn't respond. His face turned ashen, and his thoughts were chaotic. He could already feel the catastrophic consequences closing in. The morning after the incident, the police station was surrounded by journalists and protesters. The crowd held signs reading, "Justice for all," "No abuse of power," and "Equality under the law." The video of federal judge Jonathan Rivers' arrest had spread across every news outlet and social media platform, sparking nationwide outrage. Captain Thomas Grayson, understanding the gravity of the situation, called an emergency meeting with his officers. At the center of attention sat Jack Carter, his head bowed and his face pale. He was already aware of the catastrophic fallout looming over him. "Carter, you've created a circus that the entire country is now talking about," the captain bellowed. "You arrested a federal judge without justification. Do you realize this is the end of your career?" Carter, attempting to defend himself, mumbled weakly, "I didn't know he was a judge. He was being provocative. The hat." Grayson slammed his fist on the table. "A hat? You humiliated a man for his political views, and now we're all paying for your ego." A knock on the door interrupted the captain. An officer with a tense expression entered. "Sir, Judge Rivers has arrived for the press conference." Grayson nodded, throwing a stern look at Carter. "You'll be there too, and you'll answer for your actions." The press conference. The large conference room at the police station was packed with journalists, cameras, and microphones. In the front rows sat activists and representatives from human rights organizations. All eyes were on Jonathan Rivers as he entered the room with a confident stride. He wore a sharp dark gray suit and carried his bright red MAGA hat in one hand. His calm and composed demeanor left the audience in awe. Captain Grayson began the conference. "We deeply regret what occurred and offer our apologies to Judge Rivers. Officer Carter's actions were unjustified and unacceptable. An internal investigation has been launched, and he has been temporarily suspended from duty." Grayson stepped aside, allowing Jonathan to take the microphone. The judge approached it slowly, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "This incident was not just a personal humiliation, but a reminder that power demands accountability. This is not about titles or positions. Every individual deserves respect, regardless of what they wear, who they vote for, or what they believe." The room fell silent. Jonathan paused, scanning the crowd before continuing. "I hope the actions of this officer serve as a lesson to us all. We need less prejudice and more respect for the people we are sworn to protect." Applause erupted in the room. Cameras turned to Carter, who looked like a man entirely devoid of confidence. Journalists quickly directed their questions at him. "Will you apologize to Judge Rivers? Do you understand that your actions were unlawful?" Carter reluctantly approached the microphone, his voice trembling. I want to apologize to Judge Rivers for my actions. I realize I was wrong and that I made a serious mistake." The words sounded hollow, met with cool silence from the room. Jonathan watched him with an unreadable expression, though his eyes reflected quiet victory. The aftermath. The following day, the police department officially terminated Jack Carter's employment. His actions were deemed a gross abuse of power. Details of the internal investigation made headlines, and Carter's name became synonymous with bias and misconduct. Jonathan Rivers, on the other hand, emerged as a public hero. Appearing on television, he emphasized, "This story isn't just about me. It's about the rights of every individual and the need to uphold fairness and integrity, regardless of personal beliefs." In the final scene, Jonathan is seen once again walking along the same path in the park. He's wearing the same red MAGA hat, and passers-by greet him with respect. His steady posture and confident gaze serve as a reminder that justice always finds a way to prevail.